Now let's see ETFs of markets and sectors of other countries and regions. We have the ETF whose symbol is EFA, and whose objective is to replicate the performance of various securities traded on the markets of Europe, Asia, and Oceania. We have the ETF whose symbol is EEM, and whose objective is to replicate the performance of emerging markets, for example, markets as Brazil and China. We have the ETF whose symbol is EWZ, and whose objective is to replicate the performance of different Brazilian companies. We have the ETF whose symbol is FXI, and whose objective is to replicate the performance of different Chinese companies. We have the ETF whose symbol is BKF, and whose objective is to replicate the performance of the BRIC countries. BRIC is an acronym for the countries of Brazil, Russia, India, and China. We have the ETF whose symbol is RSX, and whose objective is to replicate the performance of different Russian companies. We have the ETF whose symbol is AFK, and whose objective is to replicate the performance of different African companies. We have the ETF whose symbol is ILF, and whose objective is to replicate the performance of different Mexican and South American companies. And finally, we have the ETF whose symbol is EWW, and whose objective is to replicate the performance of different Mexican companies. In terms of commodities, we also have a wide variety of ETFs. We have the ETF whose symbol is GSG, and whose objective is to replicate commodities in general, from the energy and agricultural sectors, as well as metals and others. We have the ETF whose symbol is DBA, and whose objective is to replicate commodities of the agricultural sector. We have the ETF whose symbol is MOO, and whose objective is to replicate the performance of different companies producing agricultural commodities. We have the ETF whose symbol is USO, which is one of the most well-known ETFs, and whose objective is to replicate the oil prices. We have the ETF whose symbol is UNG, and whose objective is to replicate the natural gas prices. We have the ETF whose symbol is GLD, which is one of the most popular ETFs, and whose objective is to replicate the gold prices. We have the ETF whose symbol is SLV, and whose objective is to replicate the silver prices. And finally, we have the ETF whose symbol is PTM, and whose objective is to replicate the platinum prices. It is important to mention that other instruments similar to ETFs are ETNs, which stands for Exchange Traded Notes. Like ETFs, ETNs are traded on a major exchange and track the performance of market indexes. The main difference between them is the configuration of their structure. While an ETF is composed of the components of the index, an ETN consists of debt issued by a financial institution. That is, an ETN combines aspects of a bond and an ETF. And finally, here are some examples of currency ETFs. We have the ETF whose symbol is EU, and whose objective is to replicate the euro. We have the ETF whose symbol is JYF, and whose objective is to replicate the Japanese yen. We have the ETF whose symbol is CYB, and whose objective is to replicate the Chinese yuan. We have the ETF whose symbol is BZF, and whose objective is to replicate the Brazilian real. We have the ETF whose symbol is ICN, and whose objective is to replicate the Indian rupee. We have the ETF whose symbol is FXM and whose objective is to replicate the Mexican peso. We have the ETF whose symbol is UDN and whose objective is to replicate the US dollar depreciation. And finally, we have the ETF whose symbol is UUP and whose objective, unlike the previous one, is to replicate the US dollar appreciation. It is important to note that we were mentioning some of the most well-known ETFs only as examples, but really there are hundreds of ETFs today. Now let's see what is known as tracking error. The tracking error is the difference between the performance of the ETF and the performance of the index at which attempts to replicate. The tracking error is mainly due to the strength of offer and demand that determine the ETF price as well as the time zones. These differences are mostly temporary and do not have influence on the medium and long-term performance of the ETF. Here we can see a comparison, for example, between the S&P 500 index and the SPY ETF, which is the ETF that replicates it. Notice that we can see the performances of each of them for different periods of time, and we can clearly see a strong correlation between them. Practically, the performances obtained through the ETF are the same as those of the S&P 500 index. The difference between the performances of the index and the ETF is what is known as tracking error. But as previously mentioned, these errors do not have influence on the medium and long-term performance of the ETF. Now let's see a consideration about the composition of an ETF. We must always check on the website of the company that manages the ETF as to how its portfolio is composed. That is, we must check the pool of assets in which the fund invests. This is important to consider because sometimes the name of the ETF can be misleading. For example, an ETF whose name refers to oil can be composed of the commodity itself, stocks of oil drilling companies, or stocks of companies that transport it. Here are the links of some of the most well-known companies that manage ETFs: SPDR, PowerShares, iShares, ProShares, WisdomTree, and Direxion Shares. Again, we always recommend checking on the website of the company that manages the ETF as to how its portfolio is composed, to be sure that we are investing where we want. In this image, we can see the chart of the QQQ ETF, which replicates the NASDAQ 100 index. Just like for any stock, in the case of an ETF, we perform technical analysis with the same criteria previously seen. For example, as it is indicated in the blue circle, we can see that the stock touched support, and this was accompanied by an increase in volume and an RSI below 30%. So in this case, we got a clear bullish signal. Some considerations about that. When we select an ETF to trade, we must consider liquidity. It is recommended that the ETF has a daily volume in the range of millions. If we are investing in a reverse or leveraged ETF, we must perform technical analysis to the index tracked by the ETF. Here we ended with the chapter of ETFs. In the next chapter, number 7, we will analyze one of the most important financial instruments, the options.